year was 1856, and the small, quiet town of Marietta, Ohio, sat like a forgotten dot on the map. Nestled along the winding curves of the Ohio River, its streets were unpaved, and its houses mostly built of wood and stone, with the occasional brick structure signaling wealth. Smoke rose from chimneys in the cold winter mornings, and the townspeople lived lives dictated by routine, religion, and the seasons. Life was simple, predictable, and ordinary. At least, it had been, until the day the MacIntyre family brought new life into the world. The MacIntyres were not wealthy, nor were they particularly prominent in Marietta society, but they were respected. Jonathan MacIntyre, a stern but fair man in his early 30s, ran a modest general store in town, selling flour, sugar, nails, and other essentials. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her kind heart and her delicate beauty, a gentle woman whose laughter often filled the air of their modest home. After years of marriage, the couple had prayed for children, and finally, after many months of anticipation, Eleanor became pregnant. By the winter of 1856, word had spread through the small town that the MacIntyres were expecting. In Marietta, pregnancy was treated with both excitement and superstition. Midwives and local women offered advice steeped in tradition, and though Jonathan and Eleanor were devoutly Christian, even they listened carefully to whispers of omens and warnings. Yet, none could have predicted the events that would unfold in that humble, candlelit home on the outskirts of town. Eleanor's labor began on a bitterly cold evening in December. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small wooden house, and snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground, covering the earth in silence. Jonathan sat by the hearth, a lantern flickering in his hands, his face pale with worry and anticipation. The family midwife, Mrs. Agatha Harper, a stern woman with decades of experience, was already at Eleanor's side. Her hands, though calloused and rough from years of delivering babies, were precise and confident. She murmured prayers under her breath, invoking protection for both mother and child. Hours passed. The storm outside grew fiercer, as if nature itself was conspiring to test the resolve of those inside. Eleanor groaned, sweat running down her brow, her fingers gripping the edges of the bed. I cannot. It hurts too much," she whispered, voice trembling. Jonathan took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Eleanor, breathe. You are strong. You have always been strong," he reassured her, though even he could not mask the fear in his eyes. And then, at the stroke of midnight, the first child was born, a boy, small, fragile, yet with an intensity in his dark eyes that seemed older than his mere minutes. Mrs. Harper wrapped him in a coarse linen cloth and handed him to Eleanor, who gasped at the sight of her son. Relief washed over everyone, though it was fleeting. Minutes later, a second child emerged, another boy, identical in size, shape, and, astonishingly, their facial features were almost mirrors of each other. It was rare enough to have twins. But these were so unnervingly alike that even the seasoned Mrs. Harper found herself shivering. She muttered softly to herself, recalling stories of twins in her youth, tales of superstition and omens. And then the unthinkable happened. A third child was born, another boy, identical once more, a perfect mirror of the first two. The room fell into an eerie silence. Even the wind outside seemed to still for a moment, as if nature itself held its breath. Jonathan could hardly believe his eyes. Three boys, he stammered. 3 at once. Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, her face pale. "I have seen many births in my time," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "But never 3 so alike. This is unnatural." Eleanor, exhausted beyond comprehension, barely moved, clutching her third child as though the weight of the world rested on her arms. Word of the miraculous, or perhaps terrifying birth spread through Marietta like wildfire. Neighbors arrived at the MacIntyre home, faces pressed against frost-covered windows, whispering prayers and speculation. Some believed it was a blessing from God, a rare miracle meant to bring joy to the town. Others, more superstitious, whispered that such an occurrence could only signal misfortune, that such perfection in multiples was unnatural and perhaps cursed. Yet it was not the number of children alone that unsettled people. Almost immediately, subtle anomalies became apparent. Even in the first hours, the midwife and Jonathan noticed differences in their behaviors. One child seemed alert, scanning the room with unnerving focus, while the second was lethargic, weak, almost listless. The third barely cried, but when he did, the sound was low, guttural, and hollow. Eleanor could not help but feel a deep unease. She clutched the children to her chest and whispered fervent prayers, hoping fervently that all would be well. Doctors from neighboring towns were called in the following days, as the MacIntyre's situation grew increasingly mysterious. Dr. Harold Pritchard, a young physician with a reputation for logic and reason, examined the triplets meticulously. He recorded their vital signs, their reflexes, and their physical features with precision. Yet, as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that something was off. There was a subtle but undeniable strangeness to the children, something that defied explanation. Their heartbeats did not synchronize with one another. Their breathing patterns differed, and even their reactions to light and sound were inconsistent in ways he had never observed. Mrs. Harper, who had delivered hundreds of babies, confided in Jonathan late one night. "I do not know what this is, sir," she said quietly, eyes darting around the room as though afraid the walls themselves could hear. "I have seen anomalies, yes, but never such uniformity paired with. Differences so profound. It is as if they are three separate beings in one womb, yet bound by some invisible thread of resemblance." Despite the fear and speculation, life continued. The children were named Nathaniel, Samuel, and Elijah. Jonathan did his best to maintain a sense of normalcy, teaching them basic prayers, showing them the shop, and trying to instill discipline. Eleanor, though perpetually exhausted, doted on them with a devotion that bordered on desperation. The townspeople watched, both fascinated and horrified, as the triplets grew. It became apparent that these were not ordinary children. Even in infancy, they exhibited intelligence beyond their age, understanding gestures, recognizing faces, and responding to unspoken cues. Yet, the differences in their personalities were extreme. Nathaniel was restless and curious, often crawling toward danger with fearless determination. Samuel was sickly and frail, susceptible to illness that left him bedridden for days. Elijah, the quietest of all, had a gaze that unnerved adults. He would stare for hours without blinking, as though peering into another world. Rumors began to swirl. Some claimed that the triplets were possessed, or that they were the product of some unnatural experiment. Others whispered that they were angels, sent to deliver messages that humanity could not yet understand. Jonathan and Eleanor were caught between fear and wonder, unsure whether to shield their children from the world or to allow them to grow as normal boys. But no one could ignore the unexplainable feeling that hung in the air. Visitors often left the MacIntyre home unsettled, speaking of shadows that moved strangely, of a chill that seemed to follow the children wherever they went, and of whispers that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Even the local preacher refused to enter the house after one particularly cold night, citing visions of dark figures and an oppressive presence he could not name. The birth of the MacIntyre triplets became the subject of hushed conversation across Ohio. Newspapers from nearby towns wrote of the astonishing story, though always with a cautious tone, careful not to appear superstitious. Medical journals debated the plausibility of such a birth, yet none could provide answers to the questions that gnawed at the minds of those who heard the tale. And so, the first chapter of this macabre mystery closed not with resolution, but with questions. Who were these children? Were they mere humans, or something else entirely? And, most unsettling of all, what fate awaited them in a world that was unprepared for their existence? For the people of Marietta, the answer was unclear. But one thing was certain: the birth of the MacIntyre triplets would haunt the town and the annals of history for generations to come. The ordinary, predictable life of 1856 Ohio had been shattered in a single, extraordinary night. And beneath the warmth of candlelight and the comfort of hearths, an unsettling truth lingered. Some mysteries are born not of choice, but of circumstance. And some births bring with them shadows that no one can explain. The birth of the MacIntyre triplets had already sent ripples of fear and fascination through Marietta, Ohio. But it was not merely their simultaneous appearance in the world that made them remarkable. It was what followed, as the first weeks of life gave way to months. The people who encountered Nathaniel, Samuel, and Elijah began to notice that their similarities were almost unnatural in their perfection. Every curve of their faces, every line of their small hands, the exact shade of their eyes and hair seemed identical. Yet, despite this uncanny resemblance, the differences between them were profound and often terrifying. From the very beginning, the triplets exhibited patterns of behavior that were impossible to predict. Nathaniel, the eldest by a matter of minutes, was restless, always moving, his dark eyes darting about the room with insatiable curiosity. He would crawl toward the edges of tables, pull at dangling objects, and sometimes attempt to climb furniture that could have easily caused him serious harm. But no matter how precarious the situation, he seemed to sense danger before it fully arrived. It was as if he had an innate awareness, a sixth sense that allowed him to navigate the world with unnerving precision. Samuel, in contrast, was almost the opposite. From the very first month of his life, he appeared fragile, delicate, and constantly at risk. He cried more than he slept, and even small disturbances, a loud voice, a draft from a window, or a sudden shadow would send him into panicked fits. His body seemed unusually sensitive to temperature and light. He shivered in the mildest cold and flushed in the faintest warmth. The local doctor, Dr. Pritchard, frequently examined him, noting a heart rate and breathing pattern unlike anything he had observed before. While Nathaniel thrived in movement and chaos, Samuel seemed to exist perpetually on the edge of collapse. Then there was Elijah III, quietest of them all. From birth, he exhibited a presence that was almost unnatural. Unlike his brothers, he rarely cried or fussed. He did not appear to notice when his siblings screamed or when the house was filled with noise. But it was his gaze that unsettled those who looked upon him. His eyes, though identical in color to his brothers, seemed to pierce into the very depths of a person's soul. Neighbors, visitors, and even family members found themselves inexplicably uncomfortable in his presence. Some claimed that he would stare at them for long stretches, unblinking, and that a shiver would run down their spine as though he were seeing something they themselves could not perceive. The differences did not stop at behavior, they extended into physiology as well. Dr. Pritchard, initially confident that the triplets' physical measurements would match the natural variations found in multiples, found himself confounded. The children's body temperatures differed significantly, even when in the same room and wearing the same layers of clothing. Their heartbeats and respiration rates were inconsistent, yet strangely balanced, as if the three bodies operated on three separate biological clocks. Attempts to place them on regular feeding schedules proved nearly impossible. Nathaniel could digest meals quickly, almost ravenously, while Samuel struggled, often becoming ill after feeding. Elijah, meanwhile, seemed indifferent to food, his tiny frame neither gaining nor losing weight consistently. As the months turned into a year, these inconsistencies only deepened. Each child's reaction to stimuli was unpredictable and extreme. Nathaniel would laugh uproariously at the simplest of sights, yet grow hysterical when confronted with darkness or silence. Samuel could not tolerate noise at all. The smallest clap or cough could send him into seizures of panic. Elijah seemed to perceive things that others could not. He would react to sounds before anyone else noticed them, often staring at empty corners of the room, following invisible movements with his eyes. Visitors reported the unsettling sensation of being watched, even when Elijah was across the room, his gaze unwavering. Neighbors began to speak in hushed tones about the triplets. "They are not like normal children. one mother whispered to another while walking past the MacIntyre home. You can see it in their eyes. They are something else. Some claimed that their reflections in mirrors appeared distorted when the children were near, as if the very air around them carried a subtle, imperceptible tension. Others swore they heard whispers emanating from the children, low murmurs that made no sense but sounded eerily like speech. The local midwife, Mrs. Harper, grew increasingly uneasy. She had spent decades delivering children, from the frailest infants to the strongest boys and girls. Yet she admitted privately to Jonathan that she felt something supernatural was at play. I have never encountered such uniformity and such contradiction, she confided one evening. They are three, yet each is alone. It is as if they were crafted by different hands, yet bound together by a single, unnatural design. Even Eleanor, their mother, was not immune to fear. Her love for her sons was profound. Yet she could not deny the unease that grew within her as she observed them. On more than one occasion, she had awoken in the night to find Elijah sitting upright in his crib, staring into the darkened room as though listening to voices no one else could hear. Nathaniel and Samuel, meanwhile, would sometimes behave in ways that made no sense. Nathaniel crawling to the fireplace and stopping just short, eyes wide with terror. Samuel shivering violently at an empty corner. Eleanor often whispered prayers over them, unsure whether she was protecting them or protecting herself. School age brought new revelations. As the triplets grew, their intellectual capacities began to diverge dramatically. Nathaniel learned to read and write at an astonishingly young age, absorbing knowledge with almost frightening speed. Samuel lagged behind, struggling with basic letters, numbers, and simple arithmetic, often requiring private tutoring and patience from his exhausted parents. Elijah's abilities remained enigmatic. He spoke very little. Yet when he did, his words carried a weight and clarity that defied his years. Teachers noted that his observations were uncannily precise, often predicting events or identifying patterns no one else could see. It was during these early school years that the first true confrontations with the macabre began. Other children in the town began to fear the triplets, particularly Elijah. Stories circulated of his unblinking gaze causing nightmares, of strange reactions to ordinary events, and of moments when he seemed to vanish for minutes at a time, only to reappear with a knowing smile. Nathaniel, for all his energy, would sometimes break into wild fits of crying or rage for reasons no one could determine, frightening both peers and adults alike. Samuel's illnesses became more severe, with mysterious fevers, rashes, and hallucinations plaguing him intermittently. Local clergy and spiritual leaders were called to the MacIntyre home, though few dared to spend extended time there. One preacher, Reverend Thompson, claimed to witness shadows moving independently of light, objects shifting slightly in the presence of the children, and a chill in the air so intense it caused his teeth to chatter. Another visitor, a traveling spiritualist, whispered of latent energies, suggesting that the triplets were somehow connected to forces beyond the natural world. Jonathan and Eleanor, desperate for explanations, were left with none that satisfied both logic and faith. The community's fear deepened when small, inexplicable incidents began to occur. Candles would flicker or extinguish near the children without cause. Windows, tightly shut against the winter cold, would rattle violently, yet no wind could be felt. Animals avoided the MacIntyre household entirely. The family dog refused to enter the house and would growl at empty corners. Even neighbors reported waking to sounds of soft, incomprehensible murmurs echoing from within the home in the dead of night. Medical attempts to rationalize these phenomena fell short. Dr. Pritchard tried exhaustive testing, from measuring vitals to observing reflexes and sleep patterns. He charted heart rates, feeding schedules, and sleep cycles with precision. Yet the results consistently defied natural laws. Nathaniel's rapid metabolism, Samuel's frailty, and Elijah's enigmatic calm formed a triad that seemed biologically impossible. More troubling were the subtle changes noticed over time micro-expressions, that suggested intelligence and awareness beyond their age, physical responses to unseen stimuli, and an almost telepathic synchronization between the three when they were together. By the age of 5, the triplets had become a local legend. Stories of their behavior spread beyond Marietta, reaching nearby towns and even the county seat. People spoke of the children in hushed tones, half in awe, half in fear. Some believed that the triplets were the result of divine intervention, while others insisted they were cursed, a portent of disaster. The line between reality and rumor blurred, and the MacIntyre household became both a magnet for curiosity and a source of dread. And yet, for all the fear and fascination, the children remained under the care of Jonathan and Eleanor, whose devotion never wavered. They raised the boys with love, discipline, and protection, attempting to shield them from the scrutiny and superstition of a world that did not understand them. Still, every day brought new mysteries, each child a puzzle the world could not solve. Nathaniel's daring courage, Samuel's fragile vulnerability, and Elijah's uncanny perception formed a pattern that could not be explained by medicine, science, or faith. It was in these early years that the seeds of lifelong mystery were planted. The triplets' identical appearances masked the profound differences in their essence, and the people of Marietta began to realize that they were not dealing with ordinary children. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, something that challenged the boundaries of understanding, and something that would haunt the town and history for generations. By the time they reached their 7th year, it was clear that Nathaniel, Samuel, and Elijah were more than just unusual siblings. They were 3 beings bound together by blood, yet distinct in ways that defied logic. The identical faces that had first drawn awe and curiosity now served as a mask for differences that unsettled even the most rational minds. And as the town of Marietta looked on, the whispers grew louder, the fear more palpable, and the question more urgent. Who or what were these children, truly, and what would become of them in a world unprepared for their existence? By the early 1860s, the MacIntyre triplets were no longer just a curiosity whispered about in Marietta, Ohio. They had become a medical anomaly. What had begun as quiet concern from a local midwife had escalated into something far more troubling. Physicians, scholars, and even traveling medical men began to visit the small town, drawn by rumors of 3 identical boys whose bodies and minds defied every known rule of human biology. At the center of this growing intrigue were the medical records themselves, documents that, even by the loose and imperfect standards of 19th century medicine, made absolutely no sense. Dr. Harold Pritchard, the primary physician assigned to the MacIntyre family, was a man of logic. He believed deeply in observation, documentation, and reason. Superstition, in his mind, was the refuge of ignorance. And yet, as he filled page after page with notes about Nathaniel, Samuel, and Elijah, even he began to doubt his own understanding of the human body. From the very first formal examinations, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Despite being born minutes apart and sharing identical physical features, height, bone structure, eye color, blood type, their internal measurements were wildly different. Nathaniel's heart rate was consistently elevated, sometimes reaching levels that should have caused exhaustion or collapse. Yet he showed no signs of weakness. Samuel's heart, by contrast, beat dangerously slow at times, dipping into ranges associated with severe illness or imminent failure. Elijah's heartbeat was the most disturbing of all, not because it was fast or slow, but because it was irregular in a pattern Dr. Pritchard could not chart. "It is not arrhythmic," he wrote in one entry. "It is structured, purposeful." Body temperature presented another puzzle. On multiple occasions, all 3 boys were measured within minutes of one another, in the same room, under identical conditions. Nathaniel consistently ran warm, often a full degree above what was considered normal. Samuel's temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping low enough to cause concern of hypothermia. Elijah's temperature, however, remained unnervingly stable, so stable, in fact, that it barely changed regardless of weather, illness, or exertion. Dr. Pritchard underlined this observation twice in his journal. No natural explanation. Sleep patterns offered no clarity either. Most children, especially siblings, develop similar circadian rhythms. The triplets did not. Nathaniel slept little, often waking before dawn and remaining energetic throughout the day. Samuel slept excessively, sometimes up to 16 hours, yet woke exhausted and irritable. Elijah slept in short, precise intervals, often waking at the same minute each night. On more than one occasion, Eleanor MacIntyre reported that Elijah would wake moments before church bells rang or before storms arrived. Doctors initially dismissed these claims as coincidence. They stopped dismissing them after the patterns repeated. Feeding studies were attempted primitive by modern standards, but thorough for the era. Each child was given identical meals, measured carefully at the same times. The results were baffling. Nathaniel gained weight rapidly, building muscle and strength beyond what was expected for his age. Samuel failed to gain weight consistently, despite adequate nutrition. Elijah's weight fluctuated in ways that defied caloric logic, sometimes losing weight during periods of heavy feeding and gaining it during times of reduced intake. Even digestion differed. Samuel frequently vomited undigested food hours after eating, while Nathaniel processed meals with alarming efficiency. Elijah's waist showed irregularities that physicians could not classify, leading one visiting doctor to write privately. It is as though his body does not obey the same biological economy, but the most unsettling discrepancies lay not in the physical data alone, but in the neurological observations. By the age of 6, Dr. Pritchard began conducting rudimentary cognitive and reflex tests. Nathaniel responded to pain quickly and aggressively, often before stimuli were fully applied. Samuel reacted slowly, sometimes not at all. Elijah, disturbingly, reacted before contact was made, pulling away from needles, recoiling from pressure, or flinching before sound occurred. This detail appears multiple times in the records. Subject reacts prior to stimulus. Possible anticipation, unknown mechanism. Attempts to explain this as heightened sensitivity failed when Elijah displayed the same behavior with closed eyes and covered ears. More alarming still were episodes the doctors began referring to as synchronous events. On several documented occasions, one child would experience symptoms that were mirrored partially or fully by the others, despite being in separate rooms. When Samuel suffered a severe fever, Nathaniel complained of chest pain, while Elijah became unusually withdrawn and silent. When Nathaniel injured his hand badly at the general store, Samuel developed unexplained bruising hours later. Elijah showed no physical marks, but refused to use his own hand for days. No medical framework existed to explain this. Dr. Pritchard consulted colleagues in Cincinnati and even sent copies of his notes eastward to Philadelphia. Responses came back vague and cautious. Some suggested rare congenital disorders. Others speculated about shared nervous systems or psychological influence. One letter, written anonymously, warned him to cease involvement before professional ruin. Yet Pritchard could not stop. He began compiling a separate journal, one not meant for public review. In it, his tone changed. The language became less clinical, more personal. "I fear we are observing not illness," he wrote, "but design." The triplets' blood tests, rudimentary as they were, raised further questions. Though the boys shared the same blood type, their clotting behavior differed dramatically. Nathaniel's blood coagulated rapidly, Samuel's dangerously slowly. Elijah's samples behaved inconsistently, sometimes clotting, sometimes not, even under identical conditions. One assistant reportedly refused to continue participating after observing Elijah's blood sample move unnaturally in a glass slide. This claim was officially dismissed, but the assistant resigned the following day. By now, word of the medical oddities had spread beyond Ohio. Traveling physicians, some legitimate, others dubious, arrived hoping to witness the phenomenon. A few requested permission to take the children for further study. Jonathan MacIntyre refused them all. Eleanor, however, began to notice something more frightening than medical inconsistencies. She noticed patterns in the doctors themselves. Those who spent prolonged time examining the children reported headaches, insomnia, and vivid dreams. One physician claimed to hear voices reciting numbers while examining Elijah. Another swore his pocket watch stopped working only when placed near the triplets. These reports never made it into official records, but they circulated quietly among professionals. The final turning point came in 1864. Dr. Pritchard attempted what he called a comparative isolation observation. The children were separated for several days, each monitored independently. The goal was to determine whether their anomalies were purely individual or somehow interconnected. The results terrified him. Within 24 hours, all 3 boys showed signs of distress. Nathaniel became erratic and violent. Samuel's health deteriorated rapidly. Elijah, normally calm, screamed uncontrollably for hours, a sound witnesses later described as inhuman. When reunited, the symptoms ceased almost immediately. In his final official report, Dr. Pritchard concluded, "These subjects cannot be studied independently. They do not function independently. To separate them is to provoke physiological and psychological collapse." Shortly after submitting this report, Dr. Pritchard abruptly ceased his involvement with the case. He left Marietta without explanation, abandoning his practice and never publishing his findings. His private journal vanished. What remained were fragments, partial records, second-hand accounts, and whispers of documents locked away or destroyed. To this day, historians and medical scholars who examine surviving notes agree on one point. The MacIntyre triplets were not simply ahead of science. They existed outside its boundaries. Their medical records did not just challenge existing knowledge, they contradicted the fundamental assumptions of human biology. And if those records are to be believed, then the most disturbing possibility is not that doctors failed to understand the triplets, but that the triplets were never meant to be understood at all. By the late 1860s, the town of Marietta no longer spoke of the MacIntyre triplets with curiosity. The tone had shifted. What was once fascination had curdled into fear, and fear into avoidance. People crossed the street to avoid the MacIntyre home. Children were warned not to look into its windows. Even the church bells seemed quieter on Sundays when the triplets were present. Something was changing, and everyone could feel it. The first tragedy came quietly. Samuel had always been the weakest of the 3. His body, fragile since infancy, had grown thinner with age, his face pale and drawn. He suffered from recurrent fevers that no medicine could explain, and his sleep was plagued by night terrors so intense that neighbors claimed they could hear his screams echoing through the street. In the winter of 1869, Samuel fell ill once more, but this time it was different. The fever did not rise suddenly. It crept in slowly, steadily, like a tide that could not be turned back. His skin grew cold despite burning from within. His breathing became shallow, uneven. Dr. Pritchard was long gone, and the physicians who replaced him could do little more than observe and record the decline. Nathaniel refused to leave Samuel's side. For days, he sat beside his brother's bed, unmoving, eyes hollow. Elijah stood in the corner of the room, silent, watching. Not Samuel, but the doorway. Eleanor noticed this and begged Elijah to come closer, to speak, to pray. Elijah did none of those things. On the 4th night, Samuel died. There was no dramatic moment, no final gasp. He simply stopped. His heart ceased without warning, as though someone had flipped a switch. The doctor declared the death natural, citing constitutional weakness, but no one in the room believed it, not fully. What disturbed Eleanor most was what happened next. The moment Samuel's death was confirmed, Nathaniel screamed not in grief, but in pain. He clutched his chest and collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently. Elijah fell to his knees at the exact same moment, whispering something no one could understand. 3 brothers, 1 death, all affected. Samuel was buried on a gray, overcast morning. Few townspeople attended. Those who did stood far back, as though distance might protect them. Elijah did not cry. Nathaniel did not speak. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, Elijah suddenly turned and stared directly at the preacher. "He is not gone," Elijah said calmly. "He is only elsewhere." The words spread through the town like poison. After Samuel's death, the household changed. Nathaniel became erratic, volatile in ways never seen before. He grew aggressive impulsive, prone to violent outbursts. He broke furniture, shattered glass with his bare hands, and once tried to run into the frozen river at night, claiming Samuel was calling him. Elijah, by contrast, became quieter than ever. He stopped attending school, stopped answering questions, stopped reacting to pain. But people noticed something else. They noticed that Elijah began appearing in places no one had seen him go. He was spotted standing near Samuel's grave late at night, despite the ground being frozen solid and the distance from the house significant. He was seen in abandoned buildings, in the woods, near the riverbank, always alone, always silent. When confronted, he denied leaving the house. Then came the disappearance. In the spring of 1871, Nathaniel vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no note. One evening, he was there, arguing loudly, pacing the house like a caged animal. By morning, his bed was empty. Search parties were formed. The woods were combed. The river was dragged. Posters were sent to nearby towns. Nothing. Elijah showed no reaction. When asked where his brother had gone, he answered simply, "He followed Samuel." That sentence chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. Weeks turned into months. Nathaniel was never found. Some believed he had drowned himself, driven mad by grief. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had run away or been taken. A few claimed they had seen him at night, standing near the river, watching the water as if waiting for something to rise from it. Jonathan MacIntyre aged years in a single season. His shop closed. Eleanor withdrew from the world entirely. And Elijah remained, the lone surviving triplet. But survival did not mean normalcy. After Nathaniel's disappearance, strange incidents multiplied. Livestock near the MacIntyre property began dying inexplicably bloodless, unmarked. Clocks stopped working inside the house. Visitors complained of dizziness, nausea, and crushing headaches after brief encounters with Elijah. One neighbor swore she heard two voices speaking from Elijah's room at night. Another claimed to see three shadows where only one boy stood. Dark theories began to spread quietly at first, then openly. Some believed the triplets were never three separate beings at all, but fragments of a single consciousness divided at birth. Others suggested something far older, an ancient superstition about shared souls, where one life is split across multiple bodies, unstable and dangerous. A traveling occultist passing through Ohio offered a more disturbing idea. "You witnessed a failed division," he told a small gathering. "Nature tried to separate what was never meant to be separated." Theories grew darker still. That Samuel was the body, that Nathaniel was the will, that Elijah was the mind. And now, only the mind remained. In 1873, Elijah disappeared too. No warning, no explanation. His room was found exactly as it had always been. No packed belongings, no signs of escape. Just one unsettling detail. 3 chairs arranged in a triangle at the center of the room. The MacIntyre house was abandoned soon after. Jonathan and Eleanor left Marietta, never to return. Records suggest Eleanor died shortly afterward. Jonathan vanished from public record entirely. As for Elijah, no confirmed sightings were ever recorded. Yet rumors persisted. Decades later, people claimed to see a man who looked eerily young for his age, wandering near the Ohio River, staring into the water with unblinking eyes. Some swore they heard 3 sets of footsteps when only one figure passed. Medical historians who later examined surviving documents could not reconcile the events. The timeline did not align with known psychological disorders. The physical anomalies defied explanation. The synchronized suffering, the shared reactions, the collapse following separation, it all suggested something deeply unnatural. And so the case was quietly buried, not solved, not explained, just erased. But one question remained, one that continues to haunt anyone who studies the MacIntyre triplets. If 2 died and 1 disappeared, then what exactly was born in Ohio in 1856? And did it ever truly leave? When the MacIntyre house was finally sealed shut, Marietta believed the nightmare had ended. The windows were boarded, the doors locked. Nature slowly reclaimed the land. To the town, it was closure. A grim chapter concluded by death, disappearance, and silence. But history does not forget what science fails to explain. Decades later, fragments of the MacIntyre case began resurfacing, not in folklore alone, but in academic margins, medical footnotes, and private correspondence between physicians who never dared publish their full conclusions. The triplets were no longer dismissed as superstition. Instead, they became something more disturbing, an unsolved anomaly. Modern researchers who later uncovered partial records were struck by one overwhelming realization. The MacIntyre triplets did not simply present rare conditions. They violated assumptions. The foundation of medical science rests on predictable biological laws. Development follows patterns. Genetics explains similarity. Separation does not cause collapse. Yet the triplets broke every one of these rules. Identical genetics should have produced near-identical physiology. It did not. Shared upbringing should have resulted in overlapping behavior. It did not. Separation should not have caused synchronized suffering. It did. And death should have ended influence. It did not. One of the most troubling aspects for modern scholars is the absence of degeneration in Elijah. In most documented psychological or neurological disorders involving delusion, hallucination, or dissociation, symptoms worsen, cognitive decline follows, and physical deterioration appears. Elijah showed none of these. If anything, he became more stable as his brothers vanished. That alone unsettles neurologists who have reviewed the case. Then there is the question of anticipation. Elijah's ability to respond to stimuli before it occurred, documented multiple times, cannot be easily explained by heightened perception. Reaction before cause implies either coincidence repeated to the point of impossibility, or awareness that operates outside conventional sensory input. Some researchers have speculated about temporal processing anomalies and the idea that Elijah's brain perceived time differently, accessing predictive patterns beyond conscious thought. Others suggest a neurological feedback loop so advanced it mimicked foresight. But no known disorder explains consistency without decay. The synchronized physiological responses between the brothers remain even harder to rationalize. Modern medicine acknowledges psychosomatic influence. Stress can manifest physically. Emotions can trigger symptoms, but shared injuries, mirrored pain, and collapse upon separation push far beyond psychosomatic boundaries. This has led to one controversial hypothesis: that the triplets were never biologically independent systems, that they functioned as a distributed organism, three bodies operating as components of a single, divided system. In such a model, Samuel's death was not merely the loss of one brother, it was system failure. Nathaniel's disappearance may not have been escape or madness, but redistribution. And Elijah's survival may represent not the remainder, but the convergence. This theory disturbs scientists not because it is supernatural, but because it challenges the definition of individuality. If consciousness can be partitioned, if identity can exist across multiple bodies, then what truly defines a person? The implications ripple far beyond one case in 19th century Ohio. Philosophers have revisited the MacIntyre case when debating the nature of the self. Is a human defined by body, brain, memory, or something less tangible, something that can, under unknown conditions, fracture and persist? Another unresolved mystery lies in the absence of aging records. If Elijah lived beyond Marietta, he left no official trace, no census, no death certificate, no hospital admission, no burial record. This is not uncommon for the era, but combined with persistent sightings across decades, it becomes unsettling. Reports describe a man who never seems to age, a man with familiar eyes, a man who watches, listens, and leaves. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as legend, yet they share details too precise to ignore mannerisms matching childhood descriptions, an aversion to mirrors, and a habit of standing near water for long periods, as though waiting. Waiting for what? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the mystery is not what happened, but what never happened. There was no closure ritual, no final medical conclusion, no definitive explanation. The case simply stopped. This silence troubles historians because unresolved anomalies tend to produce either breakthroughs or suppression. And suppression is often quieter than discovery. Several documents referenced in correspondence no longer exist. A journal kept by Dr. Pritchard vanished. Hospital logs were altered or destroyed. Letters hint at external pressure to leave the matter undisturbed. Why? Because the truth threatened reputations? Or because the truth threatened understanding itself? Modern science prides itself on progress, but it also quietly acknowledges limits. Every field has edge cases that do not fit. The MacIntyre triplets exist beyond that edge. They are not merely unexplained. They are unexplainable with current frameworks. And that leaves one final, haunting possibility. That the mystery persists not because we lack information, but because we lack the language to describe what truly occurred. Perhaps the triplets were an evolutionary anomaly. Perhaps a neurological experiment of nature. Perhaps something that happens once every few centuries, then disappears before it can be understood. Or perhaps they were never meant to be three. Perhaps the error was not in science. Perhaps the error was in the birth. And if that is true, if the MacIntyre triplets were fragments of something whole, then the real question is not what happened to them. It is this: what became of what they were together? Because if Elijah remained, if the others were absorbed, followed, or reclaimed, then the mystery of 1856 did not end in death or disappearance. It simply changed form. And somewhere, whether in history, memory, or something far less tangible, it may still be watching.